Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a sudden dramatic shift on the global stage, something that could reshape geopolitics overnight. Today, we're diving deep into a hypothetical, but, thoroughly researched scenario, one that has huge implications for all of us. We're talking about Russia. And specifically, the potential scenarios if Vladimir Putin were to suddenly depart the political scene in 2025. This isn't about predictions, let's be clear. It's about understanding the complex web of factors that could come into play.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is just how many layers there are to this. Our mission today is really to sift through the detailed analyses and source material we've got from international think tanks, regional news outlets, all sorts. We want to bring you the most important nuggets of insight. We'll explore where Russia stands now, then look at 3 distinct pathways for its future, and finally, what those might mean for the world. The economy, international relations, the lot.
So buckle up, because this is going to be a custom-tailored deep dive. It's designed to help you quickly become well-informed on a topic that might seem dense. But trust us, it's full of surprising facts and maybe some aha moments, too. Right, so to understand where Russia might go, we first need to understand where it stands right now in our hypothetical mid-2025. Our sources paint a very specific picture of the internal political landscape. What's the general atmosphere on the ground?
Well, by July 2025, the political system in Russia is essentially a lockdown authoritarian state. It's been meticulously built over, 20-plus years of Putin's rule. And after the 2022 Ukraine invasion, that control tightened even further. Independent media, largely gone. Opposition figures jailed or in exile. Any dissent gets crushed swiftly. Now, official polls will show high public approval for Putin that's a result of relentless propaganda, appeals to patriotism during wartime. But the reality is probably more about a lack of alternatives and, frankly, pervasive fear.
Okay, so a tightly controlled political landscape. But even with that level of suppression, are there any whispers of discontent? Or maybe specific factions within the elite who might see Putin's departure as an opportunity, even if they, dare not show it now?
Oh, absolutely. There's the powerful security bloc, the Siloviki as they're known. We're talking FSB, military intelligence, the army, Rosgvardia. They are crucial to the regime, utterly crucial. Outwardly, they're loyal, but what's fascinating is how Putin has personally balanced the interests of these powerful groups against, say, the technocrats and the oligarchs. If he's suddenly gone, that whole balancing act just vanishes. Then on the societal level, there's widespread political apathy, but also suppressed dissent. Remember those mass anti-war protests, harshly put down? New laws criminalize any criticism discrediting the army, foreign agents. Thousands of active citizens have left the country. So this surface stability, you see, it's really built on Putin's personal authority and that constant threat of coercion.
That paints a picture of, almost unwavering control. But you mentioned the economy earlier. Beneath that surface, the economic currents seem to tell a very different story. What are our sources saying about the real pressures?
The economy is under immense strain, huge strain. Russia initially weathered the sanctions shock in 2022. Sure, they even showed some growth in 2023, 2024. But that growth is almost entirely artificial, driven by a massive, massive surge in military spending. It's just not sustainable. And by late 2024, the signs of decline are stark. The ruble plummeted. Inflation, officially near 10%, feels much higher for ordinary Russians, closer to 15, maybe 20%. Even Putin himself, which is unusual for him, has acknowledged the economy is overheating, prices are rising. That tells you something.
So it's not just a struggling economy, it's one that has fundamentally reoriented itself, hasn't it, around the war effort?
Precisely. You've hit the nail on the head. Nearly 40% of all state expenses in 2024 went to defense. 40%. That cuts deeply into civilian needs. Military production is the only real industrial driver. Growth outside the VPK, that's the military-industrial complex, the war engine, is barely 3%. Civilian industries, stagnating. They're stifled by incredibly high interest rates, inflation. Businesses struggle. They lack workers, materials, and sanctions limit access to technology, pushing them into these gray schemes just to import what they need.
And what about the human cost, the impact on the workforce?
That's where it gets particularly grim. Unemployment is technically at a historic low, yes, but that's not a sign of health. It's because hundreds of thousands of men have been mobilized or at the front. They're just drained from the workforce, maybe up to 800,000 killed or wounded since the start. Now, defense sector wages have soared, attracting workers from poorer regions. But state employees, pensioners, they're seeing their real incomes decline. Pensions aren't keeping up with real inflation. Experts are predicting a full-blown recession in 2025. Ordinary Russians tolerate this for now, largely due to that intense defense of the homeland propaganda. But the economy is weakened. It's kept afloat by what amounts to manual management from the top, using reserves, military orders.
Okay, so economically strained, but maybe resilient in a brittle sort of way. What does this mean for Russia's place in the world, caught between this ongoing conflict and shifting alliances?
Well, Russia's foreign policy is completely dominated by the Ukraine war and its confrontation with what it calls the collective West. There's no decisive victory for Russia in sight. The war continues, protracted. For the Kremlin, it's framed as an existential battle, relations with the U.S. and the EU at a post-Cold War low. Unprecedented sanctions are hitting every sector: oil, gas, SWIFT, tech exports, asset freezes. Western companies left en masse. Western unity on these sanctions, it largely holds. Though, yeah, by mid-2025, you're seeing some fatigue, debates about next steps, maybe secondary sanctions. U.S. election outcomes might affect aid too. But the strategic line remains: isolate Russia. And the ICC warrant for Putin adds another layer of pariah status.
So Russia is an international pariah in the West, definitely. But they've clearly pivoted, found new partners. How significant is that shift, really?
I think the real takeaway here isn't just a list of new allies. It's the stark reality of Russia's, well, diminished sovereignty. Russia, once a global power, is now fundamentally dependent on China. China is their economic lifeline, largest oil and gas buyer, main supplier of essential goods. It's compensating for lost European markets. This strategic partnership, it's deep-rooted, growing military ties, joint exercises. However, and this is crucial, China isn't an unconditional ally, not at all. Beijing publicly pushes for negotiations in Ukraine. They seem to fear Russian nuclear escalation, and they carefully avoid Western secondary sanctions. So they'll help economically, yes, but generally seem to avoid supplying lethal weapons directly.
Right. So China's a lifeline, but maybe one that comes with strings attached?
Yeah.
Silent but profound strategic limitations. What about other non-Western partners?
Yeah, Russia has strengthened ties with others. India is a big oil buyer, then Turkey, Iran, Gulf states, parts of Latin America, Africa. These are often pragmatic relationships based on trade, weapons, energy, sometimes a shared opposition to U.S. influence. But you have to remember, these partners pursue their own interests. They're balancing between Russia and the West. Most UN countries condemned the invasion, remember? China and India abstained, which was significant. So overall, Russia's international position in mid-2025 is defined by isolation from developed democracies, a growing dependence on China, limited cooperation elsewhere, and that rogue state status because of the war.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for the critical question. Let's turn to the central hypothetical, the sudden death of Vladimir Putin in July 2025. Our sources suggest experts agree this is probably the most likely trigger for a power change, not fair elections, not a revolution. So what would that actually mean, constitutionally, right in the immediate aftermath?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Russian constitution is, on paper, remarkably clear. The prime minister who, in this 2025 scenario, is Mikhail Mishustin, immediately assumes presidential duties, temporarily. The Federation Council then has just 14 days to call early elections, which means a new president should, theoretically, be elected within 3 months. But, and it's a big but, as we'll see, the real dynamics, the real power plays, might diverge pretty significantly from the letter of the law.
Okay, let's dive into that first potential pathway then, a hard succession. What does this look like? Who are the key players in that kind of scenario?
Right, this is the Siloviki successor scenario. Basically, power transfers very quickly, almost seamlessly, to a representative from that security bloc we mentioned, someone from Putin's deepest inner circle, backed by the special services, the military, the whole Siloviki apparatus. Think of it as a kind of quiet coup, really, designed purely to preserve the existing regime. Potential figures, our sources mention. People like Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, an old FSB hand, or FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov, maybe Rosgvardia head Viktor Zolotov. Mishustin is the constitutional interim leader, yes, but he lacks his own power base. He'd effectively be relying on or controlled by the Siloviki.
So the security apparatus would essentially take control. How would they manage that transition, that consolidation?
They'd act swiftly, and with a united front, that's key. Upon news of Putin's death, senior security officials would immediately seize the reins. A tight inner circle, maybe the Security Council itself, decides on their man for the upcoming elections, and they ensure his victory by any means necessary. They might even delay elections, using the ongoing war as a pretext, maybe declaring a state of emergency. They'd secure key locations, government buildings, TV stations, control all information channels. Publicly, they'd assure the population the situation is under control. You'd likely see troops on the streets in Moscow, swift arrests of any perceived troublemakers. Putin gets immediately canonized, hailed as a national hero, and the successor, presented as simply continuing his course, his legacy. This implies a continuation of authoritarian policies, maybe even harsher ones. Martial law, total censorship, talk of enemies of the people. Mass protests seem unlikely given the shock and the immediate tight control. The public, under intense surveillance, would probably just accept the official narrative. Fear and uncertainty would dominate.
And what would this hard succession, the Siloviki takeover, mean for Russia's foreign policy, especially regarding the war in Ukraine?
Foreign policy would either stay exactly the same or possibly become even more aggressive. A new Silovik leader might feel the need to escalate the war, maybe try for a quick, decisive victory to solidify his mandate. Some sources call this an Andropov scenario, harking back to Yuri Andropov's hardline stance during the Cold War. This means further militarization, more confrontation with the West, maybe ultimatums, perhaps even nuclear posturing, demonstrations. Compromise on Ukraine, almost unthinkable in this scenario. Economically, ties would shift even more heavily towards China and other friendly countries. The besieged fortress ideology intensifies. Now, such a successor could hold control short-term, sure, but the long-term risks are significant. They lack Putin's unique charisma, that personal authority, and worsening living standards could eventually undermine stability. In essence, the phrase might be, Putin died, but Putinism lives on.
That's the iron fist scenario. But our sources also detail another path, a more cautious one, perhaps more pragmatic. A managed transition. How would that unfold? Who architects that?
Right, this is the second scenario, the managed transition. Here, the elites actively try to avoid chaos. They agree on a temporary, sort of collective power structure, one that leads to a mutually acceptable successor through managed elections. This path largely follows the constitutional procedure we talked about. Mikhail Mishustin acts as the interim transitional leader. Behind the scenes, various influence groups, technocrats, maybe some oligarchs, parliamentary leaders, even factions within the Siloviki search for a compromise figure. Someone who can lead the state permanently, preserving the core system but reducing the really sharp risks. You could maybe compare it to Yeltsin handing power to Putin back in '99, though the historical context is totally different, of course.
Okay, a more orderly handover. How would the critical players, the Siloviki, the security services, behave in this situation? Would they go along with it?
In this scenario, crucially, the Siloviki act as guarantors of order, not as power grabbers. The FSB, the army, the Rosgvardia, they'd pledge loyalty to the Constitution, to the interim president. Their focus would be on preventing destabilization, extremism, protecting key sites. They wouldn't openly push their own candidate, because they'd understand the immense risk of a split within their own ranks if they did. Now, behind closed doors, there'd be deals. A backroom compromise might involve the Siloviki accepting a neutral technocratic successor, maybe Mishustin himself or someone similar. But in return, they'd demand guarantees. Their privileges preserved, immunity from prosecution, perhaps guarantees for Putin's legacy, protection against purges. So the security apparatus takes a more cautious, supportive, but still powerful background stance.
And who would be the likely faces of this more moderate transition, the potential compromise candidates?
Mikhail Mishustin is often mentioned. He lacks his own independent power base, which might actually make him more acceptable to various factions. He's seen as a competent technocrat. Other figures our sources float include Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, seen as an effective manager, maybe Alexei Dumin, a governor, former Putin bodyguard who has ties to different groups. Even Dmitry Medvedev is sometimes mentioned, though he's controversial. But any candidate would need to be acceptable to the Siloviki, the bureaucracy, and the oligarchs. It's a balancing act. The collective elite's goal here isn't radical change. It's Putin's system without Putin himself. Maintain the authoritarian fundamentals, but maybe sand off the roughest edges, adjust the extremes for stability.
What would this mean for the average Russian citizen and for Russia's stance on the world stage?
Domestically, the authorities' rhetoric would likely soften a bit. The new interim leadership pledges stability. They honor Putin's memory, of course, but they'd carefully prepare the population for some adjustments. You might hear a more conciliatory tone. Promises of a patriotic course, yes, but also signals about addressing economic difficulties, about uniting for the future. Pressure on business, on regional governors might ease slightly as the center seeks loyalty during the transition. Mass protests seem unlikely as the government projects this image of an organized constitutional election process. So citizens would probably feel a mix of anxiety, but also cautious optimism, a wait-and-see attitude. On the foreign policy front, a partial correction seems likely. The new leader might declare a kind of détente policy, Maintain Russia's strategic positions, sure, but show readiness for limited concessions, maybe to get some economic relief. Some call this a Khrushchev scenario, seeking to reduce tensions after a hardline period. This could involve freezing the conflict in Ukraine. Maybe unilateral ceasefire, an armistice fixing the front lines, just to gain a pause and ease sanctions pressure. Full withdrawal from Ukraine, highly improbable. But gestures of goodwill, pulling back troops from some areas, might occur in exchange for partial sanction relief.
Right, so a kind of Putin-light approach. Less external adventurism, more focus on stabilizing things at home, especially the economy.
Exactly. A détente window could open up in the first, say, 6 to 12 months. You'd see less hostile rhetoric, maybe restoration of some communication channels with the EU and the US. Relations with China would remain close, definitely. Beijing might even try to position itself as a peacemaker in this scenario. Economically, Russia would actively seek sanctions easing, trying to get access to technology and investment again. Historically, many experts consider this scenario the most probable. Why? Because elites generally prefer to avoid both a brutal new dictatorship and a total collapse of the state. It's the path of least resistance, perhaps.
Okay, that makes sense. But then there's the third possibility, the worst-case scenario, the one everyone hopes to avoid, chaos. How could Putin's death trigger an elite split and destabilization?
This elite split scenario is triggered if Putin's death leads to acute open conflict among the elites, because there's simply no agreed-upon successor. It sparks a raw power struggle. A political crisis unfolds rapidly. Competing clans or factions emerge, relying on different security structures. The army versus the FSD, for example. This leads to divided loyalties within the military, the special services, even among regional leaders. It's easily the most chaotic scenario, risking a collapse of central authority, widespread unrest. Now, direct civil war isn't seen as the most likely outcome by most sources, but it's not ruled out entirely. Especially if this happens against a backdrop of major military failures in Ukraine or a sudden economic collapse.
So the cracks that Putin personally papered over just explode once he's gone.
Precisely. You can see a situation by mid-2025 where, if the war is stagnating, resources are depleting, discontent is growing among both the radical hawks who think the war isn't fought hard enough and the moderate technocrats fed up with isolation and economic decline. Without Putin acting as the ultimate arbiter, these contradictions just blow up. A brief period of uncertainty follows his death, sure. Mishustin is formally interim president, but his orders might just be ignored by powerful figures. Several power centers could emerge almost immediately. You might have the hardline Siloviki, maybe around Patrushev. Parallel to them, the technocrats and moderates Mishustin, Sobyanin, some oligarchs pushing for a calm transition, and then possibly a radical nationalist wing, maybe led by warhawks, demanding total war and rejecting any perceived weakness.
Wow, that sounds like an instant descent into a power vacuum. How would the security services, usually presented as this monolithic bloc, react?
That's the key feature here. The security bloc itself splits. It becomes disunited. The FSB might compete openly with the military leadership. The Rosgvardia, the National Guard, could be torn between loyalties depending on who their commanders back. Regional security structures, local police, local FSB branches, they might just adopt a wait-and-see approach or hedge their bets. The unified vertical of power just breaks down. You can see some generals siding with one candidate, others with another. Some might seize the opportunity for local gain, maybe asserting regional autonomy. For instance, in Moscow, maybe the FSB backs Patrushev, while the Ministry of Defense supports someone else. Meanwhile, a powerful regional figure like Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya could declare special status for his region until Moscow sorts itself out. You might even see clashes between different Kremlin Guard units or security factions fighting for control of key assets or resources. It becomes dangerously fragmented.
And what's the impact on the ground for ordinary citizens? And what happens to the war in Ukraine in this chaos?
For citizens, the initial days are marked by immense uncertainty, fear. They get contradictory signals, different telegram channels, maybe even rival TV stations broadcasting competing claims to leadership. Spontaneous public gatherings might occur, not just protesting, but people trying desperately to figure out who is actually in charge. Opposition forces, if daring organizers emerge, would absolutely try to seize this moment, reviving calls for peace, for political freedom. These rallies could easily escalate into wider unrest, especially if security forces are divided and unable or unwilling to crack down immediately. Regional protests could flare up too, maybe separatist movements in national republics sensing weakness at the center, or social protests in struggling towns blaming Moscow for collapsing living standards. Normal government functions, they likely cease. Pension payments disrupted. Crime increases as police get drawn into political struggles. It's a picture of turbulence. This couldn't last long. Either one group violently suppresses the others and takes control, or the country descends into prolonged multifocal instability.
That sounds utterly terrifying, especially, as you said, for a nuclear power. What's the international fallout in this scenario?
Foreign policy becomes completely unpredictable. It takes a backseat to the internal power struggle. In Ukraine, Russian troops would likely be unable to conduct offensive operations. The front could even collapse due to weakened central command. Ukraine, backed by the West, would almost certainly launch a decisive counteroffensive. You could see rapid withdrawals, even chaotic flight of Russian units from occupied areas. Individual commanders might negotiate local truces just to save their troops. And yes, the nuclear risk. It's a horrific concern. If multiple factions gain control over parts of the arsenal, the risk of unauthorized use or loss of control is real, though the global community, especially the US and China, would make urgent, likely covert efforts to prevent that, maybe even special operations to secure facilities. Western reaction? Alarm. NATO would increase border security massively. They might try to negotiate with whoever seems most reasonable in Moscow, offer humanitarian aid, mediation, but direct military intervention, highly unlikely, too risky, could provoke even greater Russian nationalism. Sanctions wouldn't be lifted, they'd likely tighten to contain the chaos.
And China. How would Beijing respond to its key partner descending into chaos?
For Beijing, it's a huge dilemma. They benefit from a predictable, stable Russia, not chaos, and they dislike revolutions on their border. China would likely try to covertly support whichever faction seemed most capable of restoring order quickly, probably the most pro-Russian one, maybe the Siloviki if they looked like winning. If Russia genuinely starts to fragment, China might even consider deploying limited peacekeeping contingents to the Russian Far East, citing protection of its interests or citizens. Or just increase economic and military control over border territories quietly. Direct military intervention is improbable. They'd more likely boost intelligence gathering and be ready to work with whoever ultimately wins, as long as some single center of power eventually reemerges. This elite split scenario seriously risks Russia's fragmentation. It's similar in some ways to the chaos following the USSR's collapse in the early 90s, or even echoes of the time of trouble centuries ago. While historically Russia tends to centralize after crises, the probability of fragmentation increases significantly if Putin's death happens amid major military defeats and economic collapse.
Okay, let's try and put this all into perspective. Can we quickly compare these three distinct paths across the key factors, just to distill the core differences?
Right, a quick glance comparison, good idea. So, scenario one, Siloviki successor. Who takes power? A security figure. How did the Siloviki act? Consolidated, they suppressed dissent. The public. Fearful, passive, foreign policy. Aggressive, the war in Ukraine continues. Scenario two, managed transition. Who's in charge? A collective elite choice, probably a technocrat like Masutin. Siloviki, they support order, follow the constitution nominally, public, calm, adopts a wait-and-see attitude, foreign policy. Possible détente, maybe a freeze in Ukraine. Scenario three, elite split. Who leads? No single leader. Competing centers emerge. Siloviki, they're split, they clash. Public. Faces chaos, potential protests, unrest, foreign policy. Utterly unpredictable. Potential war collapse, fragmentation, and yes, that nuclear risk. And it's really important to stress, as our sources do, that a liberal democratic scenario where the current opposition takes power and pivots fully to the West is generally seen as highly unlikely in the short term after Putin's death. Given the opposition's current state and the Siloviki's entrenched power, that kind of change could only emerge maybe as a long-term consequence of a prolonged, deep crisis, perhaps out of the ashes of scenario three.
Right. Now that we've seen the possible paths, let's explore their real-world impact. Across different timeframes, how does this actually affect Russia's economy, its foreign policy, immediately, medium-term, long-term?
Okay, let's look at the short term, say the first 6 months. Economically, regardless of the path, there's immediate uncertainty. Financial market shock, expect the ruble to collapse, stock market to fall, capital flight. The central bank would likely freeze trading, limit cash withdrawals. Now, in scenarios 1, Siloviki, and 2, managed transition, authorities would probably manage to stabilize the situation relatively quickly. Economic continuity, using reserves. But scenario 3, elite split, that means a much deeper economic hit. Goods shortages, potential payment paralysis, a banking crisis, black markets flourishing. Huge uncertainty would crush consumer activity. Externally, partners adopt a wait-and-see approach. Western countries likely hold off on immediate new sanctions unless there's a major escalation. Their focus is understanding who's in control, especially of the nuclear weapons. In the controlled transit scenarios, 1 and 2, Western policy remains status quo initially, but cautious contacts might emerge. China publicly supports stability, might offer economic support like loans or trade deals to bolster the new regime, whichever it is. In scenario 3, China halts major projects, enhances border security.
BRICS nations wait for clarity. And the war in Ukraine. Scenario 1. War continues, maybe intensifies after regrouping. Scenario 2. High chance of a pause, a tactical truce, maybe a goodwill gesture. Ukraine remains vigilant, local ceasefires might emerge. Scenario 3. Frontline disarray, potential Russian defeats. Ukraine could exploit the internal chaos for territory gains. The nuclear risk exists but remains low. It's a deterrent, not likely a tool of first resort. The West might even quietly temper Ukraine's advance to allow more moderate forces in Moscow a chance to stabilize.
Okay, that's the immediate aftermath. What about the medium term? Looking 1 to 2 years out, how would these scenarios really diverge by then?
Big divergence here. Let's take them one by one. Scenario 1, Siloviki. By 2027, Russia is more closed, more militarized. Foreign policy is hostile, maybe increased risk of new conflicts, Moldova, Baltics threats, nuclear blackmail. The economy is likely in significant recession. Unsustainable military spending drains reserves. Living standards decline, met by more propaganda, more repression. Sanctions remain, maybe tighten. The war in Ukraine grinds on positionally or intensifies after huge effort, likely entering a phase of mutual exhaustion. Russia remains isolated, poor, but internally controlled by fear, holding core territories. Allied only with a few other authoritarian states. Scenario 2, managed transition. By 2027, you see partial normalization, a more pragmatic foreign policy. A peace agreement for Ukraine is likely, probably a frozen conflict, status quo, declared mission accomplished. This could lead to easing some sanctions, maybe specific financial ones. Partial export relief, but Western relations improve slightly to tolerable. Diplomatic channels reopen. China maintains friendship, maybe acts as peacemaker. Russia's economy gradually recovers. Lower military spending helps, mobilized workers return, investment climate improves slightly, high-tech sanctions probably remain, but some tech filters in via third countries. Russia might achieve weak economic growth, reduced inflation, stabilized living standards, still poor and technologically behind pre-war levels, still authoritarian, but less aggressive externally. Scenario 3. Elite split chaos. This is the most pessimistic and uncertain. Two subpaths here. 1. A quick dictatorship emerges after a brutal struggle. This new regime would be extremely repressive. The economy would have plummeted, double-digit GDP fall, maybe hyperinflation. The Ukraine war would likely end in a decisive Russian defeat, maybe pushed back to pre-war borders, forced into a humiliating peace deal. The new dictator might accept a kind of breast peace just to consolidate power internally. Some sanctions might be lifted for humanitarian reasons, but the regime remains restricted. Tense relations with the West. China cooperates cautiously. By 2027, Russia is severely weakened, perhaps semi-confederated but formally united under a new autocrat. Slow economic recovery, reliant on external aid. 2. Protracted fragmentation. If no single force gains full control quickly, Russia enters prolonged instability. By 2027, it could functionally break into multiple competing centers. Foreign policy vanishes, replaced by regional factions seeking patrons abroad. Ukraine fully restores its territory. Some Russian republics might even secede. The world is extremely concerned about the nuclear arsenal, the humanitarian situation. You might see international missions, maybe peacekeeping forces. Economically, think early 1990s Russia, or worse. Broken trade ties, ruble collapse, barter economy. Eventual stabilization happens on a new basis, maybe multiple independent states, or a new, much looser federation. This removes Russia's immediate military threat, but creates huge new risks of catastrophe and uncontrolled regimes.
And finally, the long-term picture, 5 years and beyond. What are the potential lasting consequences of these paths? Where could Russia end up by, say, 2030?
Okay, long-term possibilities. Under authoritarian stability, emerging from scenario 1, or potentially the quick dictatorship, part of 3, Russia remains a unitary authoritarian state. The ruling ideology is ultranationalism, maybe revanchism. The economy stagnates or degrades, becoming more like Iran or North Korea, reliant on internal resources, limited trade with allies. Relations with the West remain hostile. Foreign policy is a constant source of tension. Local adventures, cyber attacks, nuclear blackmail perhaps, but maybe lacking the capacity for major conventional war. Repression continues internally. Then there's conditional normalization, likely emerging from scenario 2, the managed transition, sometimes called a post-Putin NEP, like Lenin's new economic policy. Russia gradually exits deep international isolation. Many trade restrictions might be lifted over time. Oil and gas traded without huge discounts. Integration continues with China, India, maybe even parts of Europe eventually. The Ukraine conflict is resolved or deeply frozen. Western relations improve, not full partnership, but no immediate military threat perception. Gradual lifting of sanctions, especially personal ones. Russia adopts a kind of authoritarian modernism, focusing on economic recovery, living standards, maybe even a limited societal thaw, some political prisoners released, censorship eased slightly if pragmatism prevails, and finally, reforms and transformation. This is seen as the least likely only possible after significant upheaval, perhaps following the fragmentation path of Scenario 3. Russia begins genuine political reforms. A new generation of politicians emerges, untainted by the Putin system or the war. They propose a new social contract. And aggression abroad focus on economic recovery in return for gradual political opening. This could lead eventually to most sanctions being lifted, renewed investment, Russia's reintegration into the global market, relations with neighbors improve, Russia might even join new alliances. But again, this relies on a profound elite change, which seems unlikely immediately post-Putin. It's a distant but potentially more favorable long-term outcome.
So what does this all really mean for you, listening to this? As we've unpacked these complex, sometimes frankly alarming scenarios, one thing seems crystal clear. The sudden passing of Vladimir Putin in 2025 would be an immense test for the Russian state, with massive ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely, and it raises that fundamental question. Can a system built so heavily, for so long, around one individual truly adapt peacefully? Our sources suggest that a soft or managed transition, Scenario 2, might be preferred by many within the elites purely for their own survival. But the Siloviki, the security forces, would undoubtedly try to play a key, perhaps decisive role in any scenario. And let's not forget the external players. Both the West and China have incredibly strong interests in influencing the outcome. Neither wants total chaos in a nuclear-armed state, but their preferred endgames differ significantly.
The immediate future seems to hold economic shock for Russia, pretty much regardless of the path taken. But the medium-term and especially the long-term outlooks, they diverge dramatically. From deepening isolation and militarization under a hardline successor to a slow, pragmatic normalization, or even, theoretically down the line, a dramatic transformation following potential chaos.
Ultimately, the Russia of 2025 to 2030 will simply not be the same as Putin's Russia. Even if, on the surface, the successor tries to mimic him, that central pillar, that unique personal authority would be gone. And that opens up new, perhaps currently unimaginable directions for its development. As one expert we read observed, predicting the exact successor is almost impossible. A dark horse could easily emerge from the shadows in a crisis. History is just full of surprises like that. And this kind of sudden transition could absolutely set off a chain of events with profound consequences for global politics for decades to come.
Something to mull over, isn't it? This deep dive has explored the intricate possibilities, hopefully giving you a comprehensive yet concise understanding of a truly momentous geopolitical hypothetical. Stay curious and keep digging deeper.